Hello, everyone. So before we get into the conclusion of World War One, and then as we get into also the U.S. entry, which was very important, I want you to look back real quick at prompt 7 from the work you did from the last work, and I want you to think about the journal today, which is pretty much the exact same question around the exact same image. So if you have not done this yet, you are going to have to finish up part 1 because part 2 is going to make no sense to you unless you know what's going on in part 1, and you're going to have to do a answer to prompt number 7, what you think the message of this cartoon is. Remember, you have all these different helmets, which should give you a tip that they are from different countries, right? And you have over here a figure who is up against the wall, a deserter, which is to say somebody who leaves and stops fighting at the front, stops fighting for the army they're fighting for, and deserts the army. Not necessarily to fight for another one, but to leave. Who might this figure look like? Well, you might be thinking some religious figures. You might be right. So that's something to think about, a religious figure here. Why would that particular religious figure of so much significance in Europe be up against a wall, about to be shot by these soldiers from different countries? Why don't you think about that? And if you haven't already answered the journal and the prompts from the last stuff, the last lecture, you should do that, and the can do the exact same thing for the journal or a little bit different. So go ahead and do that. One way or another, one thing that you should be realizing is that the war was getting nasty, and there were a lot of people who were not too happy about it anymore. It had long been in a stalemate where not much had been changing, and there were some events that began to finally change that. So one of them happened to be the entry of the United States into World War One. What took you so long? Around 1917, which is, wow, 3 years after it started, right? So that took a while. And the U.S., of course, came tromping in with uh, our usual subtlety. Of course, this is not the United States on this image. This is supposed to be Germany, wearing a big German helmet, and obviously with the subtlety of the United States, showing how Germany is doing terrible things to Europe. Germany being portrayed as a giant marauding killer ape. So yeah, got to do a whole different thing going on here. We're going to talk about why the United States joined the war, but also why it took so long for the U.S. to join the war. To think about that, let's look back at U.S. immigration patterns. So from 1840 to 1860, which is to say a lot of the people in the United States at like a period when a lot of people were coming in, they were also coming in through the 10s and 20s. But a lot of people coming in 1840 to 1860. And the composition of these people, who had become very much part of the social and political fabric of the United States, were very much split between different countries, not just these three, but we are talking about a predominance of immigration from England, from Germany, from Ireland. There were also people coming in from Eastern Europe. There are people coming in from Southern Europe, from Italy. A lot of people coming in from all over Europe. But in particular, we're looking at these countries because of their specificity in relation to the war and how the war was being fought and who the war was being fought between, right? So let's think about all these people from all these different countries in the United States, many of them becoming Americans, of course, and not really having any sort of allegiance to the country they came from or where their parents came from, but some affinities to these ideas and cultures. So in 1914, President Woodrow Wilson made a statement of neutrality tied to the United States' long connection to neutrality. Of course, we were intervening and doing all kinds of fighting in this hemisphere in the Americas as part of the Monroe Doctrine, where we felt that it was the United States' dominion to keep control of all of the Americas. And that included the war with Spain in 1898, where we actually took Spain's colonies, including Puerto Rico, and way out east, the Philippines, and the war with Mexico in 1848, where we actually basically took control of most of what is the west of the United States. So, and also these small wars that were happening in Latin America that we were backing up various forces. So the U.S. was very involved in the Western Hemisphere, in particular in the Americas, but not so much in Europe. And that was because here's a statement of Wilson's that encapsulates it. The people of the United States are drawn from many nations, and chiefly from the nations now at war. It is natural and inevitable there should be utmost variety of sympathy and desire among them with regard to the issues and circumstances of the conflict. Some will wish one nation, others another, to succeed in the momentous struggle. It will be easy to excite passion and difficult to allay it. That's to cut it down. Those responsible for exciting it will assume a heavy responsibility. Responsibility for no less a thing than the people of the United States, whose love of their country and whose loyalty to its government should unite them as Americans all, bound in honor and affection to think the first of her inner interests, made to be divided in camps of hostile opinion, not hot against each other, involved in the war itself in impulse and opinion, if not in action. So Wilson, in key here, was afraid of Americans fighting each other over their own ethnic backgrounds from European countries. Something that was, maybe not unfounded, hard to tell. American neutrality, one way or another, was a very important principle. So officially, the United States was a neutral country, not involved on anybody's side. We were capitalist. We were involved in selling stuff, and we were becoming a industrial powerhouse very quickly. We became one of the world's manufacturing centers very fast. And so, especially in the early 1900s, we got real dominant in that. So you can see from this line here how much our exports were going up as we were only importing a little bit more. But during this period, lots of exporting. Whoa, what happened between 1914 and 1915? That's interesting. Almost like there is some kind of a conflict where people were buying a bunch of stuff. I wonder what? Oh, yeah, maybe that was food, weapons, oil, steel, and other goods that were being used in war. And in fact, we were selling those far more with the Allied powers. That's to say, Britain, France, and and Russia, but especially Britain and France, than with the Central Powers, which is to say Germany and Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire and Italy, right? So these terms are starting to be used more frequently now, with those for the Allied powers and the Central Powers being used for Germany and Austria-Hungary, Italy and Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire, whereas the Allied powers are starting to be used for France, England, Russia, and also all the colonies fighting around that. So these terms were starting to be used more commonly. And so we were trading, especially with England, a lot. So this tied into freedom of the seas, because how are you going to get those things across to sell? That would be the ocean. So the U.S. as a neutral nation claimed the right to trade with either side in the war. So technically we were neutral, and so we were claiming the right to trade with any of them. So here's a cartoon. Britannica must be more careful how she rules the waves. This is from the Chicago Tribune. So here's England with a baseball bat pointing at Germany. I'm trying to hit him. So there's this whole idea of an English blockade trying to avoid us selling stuff to Germany, especially weapons, right? And so American shipping here is whining. The idea of neutral commerce and things were whining. Interesting. Business wanted something specific because Britain and Germany were setting up blockades around the British and German coasts. Germany in particular was able to really take control of this because they had a thing called a U-boat, a submarine, an underwater boat. And these were going to prove pivotal to what ended up happening coming up. Here's one. That's a U-boat. That's a submarine. That's a big gun. There's some boats on the horizon. You can bet that those boats aren't necessarily seeing this one. Uh-oh. Trouble ahead. Trouble ahead. German submarines called U-boats torpedoed enemy ships and neutral ships trading with the enemy. So they could be all the way underwater torpedoing these ships. A German U-boat torpedoes a steamer circa 1916. Look at this. There's footage of this. Boom. That is the torpedo itself. This is being shot from the U-boat. They are taking pictures and video of this stuff to show their military power. So they're torpedoing the steamer. Whoa, why are they torpedoing all these merchant ships? What's going on? Why are they knocking out all these merchant ships? I wonder. Here's another one. John Bull being the British, a caricature for the British. It'd say, can't you say I'm a bloomin' Yankee? And here's a German, who is it, wat boat? And this is a Lusitania, which you'll hear about in a minute. So this is the idea of them using the American flag, flying the American flag from a boat for protection, but it's actually a British ship. Interesting. So what's this leading to? Well, here's the Lusitania, a very famous ship. At the time, the largest ship in the world, an enormous steamer, a passenger ship with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of passengers. Larger than the Titanic. Big ship. In 1915, a German submarine torpedoed the Lusitania, a British passenger ship, killing approximately 1,200 people, including 128 Americans. Uh-oh, big trouble. So what's this going to be going into? Well, first off, why did they do that? Why did they bomb a passenger ship? Well, one way or another, it made a big splash. The Lusitania killed, it killed a lot of people. Um, Here's a New York Times headline: apparently twice torpedoed off the Irish coast, sank in 15 minutes. Not much time for people to get off. They saved the captain. Um, Washington was starting to get a little steamed about this. This is a little bit earlier, so this is 1915. We didn't enter the war yet, quite, but people were getting kind of steamed about it. Americans were pretty infuriated about the Lusitania, and we did not forget. There's some important things to remember about the Lusitania, though. Let's look at what was on the Lusitania. What was on the manifest? What was it carrying? Okay, there's some copper. What's copper? Copper can be used for all kinds of things, including military purposes. Lots of beef can be used for things like feeding soldiers, right? Canned vegetables, canned meat especially, right? Things like that. But where do we go with these big numbers here? So, ammunition. 1,271 cases of ammunition. Military goods, 189 packages of military goods, dry goods, which are military goods, military rations, huh? Interesting. I mean, of course, there's some candy too. There's some confectionery, but lots of stuff that can be used. Cartridges and ammunition, 4,200 cases. That's a lot of cartridges and ammunition, worth $152,000. The single most valuable thing on this manifest. So there was a lot of military goods in here, and machines and things that could be used for making more military goods. So the Germans were certainly aware of that, and they were aware of what was being sold to the British, because this stuff was all going to the British. So you're getting an idea here of what was happening. So there goes, and of course that also kills 1,200 people. So we're talking about a lot of complicated problems here. A lot of people are really mad about this. Here's another one. There's a depiction of one called the Patience. Right, the U.S. Patience. I can tell you what's happening. It's going under. Here's this periscope from a submarine, a U-boat. The latest submarine victims, maybe the last, because they kept bombing them. And then things kept building up over the next couple years. Whoa, some promise. You join with Germany and you get a bit of the United States. Who's this talking to? This is the Zimmermann telegram. It was a secret message from the German foreign minister, Zimmermann, to Mexico, urging Mexico to attack the United States if the United States declared war on Germany. Oh, that's a thing. So Germany was promising, again in secret, in a coded secret message here in a telegram, they promised to help Mexico regain land that it lost to the U.S. in the Mexican War of 1848. That includes California, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, much of Colorado. So yeah, we're talking about a lot of land, which a lot of people were still quite resentful, especially resentful of that in Mexico. This is only a few decades earlier, and that was a third of Mexico's territory. So Germany was promising Mexico, if you back this up, we'll help you regain this land. And Mexico is a major power at this point. So this was the final straw, and the U.S. just declared war on the Central Powers in early 1917 because, and again, the Central Powers being Germany and Austria-Hungary and Italy at this point. Germany, Austria-Hungary, and so we had a whole different situation going on. So the Zimmermann telegram, as received by the German ambassador to Mexico, this was the code, right? You see all this code, and it got decoded. So the decoded words were these. They had some special decoding experts, and it's saying this whole thing. We're going to help you get back Texas and all these different parts of the United States and take them back for Mexico. Here's the decoded message. We intend to begin on the 1st of February unrestricted submarine warfare, which is to say we shall endeavor, in spite of this, to keep the United States of America neutral. In the event of this not succeeding, we make Mexico a proposal of alliance on the following basis: make war together, make peace together, generous financial support, and an understanding on our part that Mexico is to reconquer the lost territory in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. Don't forget California. The settlement and detail is left to you. You will inform the president of the above most secretly as soon as the outbreak of war with the United States is certain, and add the suggestion that he should, on his own initiative, invite Japan to immediate adherence and at the same time mediate between Japan and ourselves. Please call the president's attention to the fact that the ruthless employment of our submarines now offers the prospect of compelling England in a few months to make peace. So what they're saying is they're going to get your land back. We're going to end this war. If you got to fight, we'll fight with the United States. If we got to fight with them, we'll fight with them too. You're going to fight with them too. They'll have to fight on two fronts. And wow, U.S. is just going to end up losing. They're also trying to get Japan involved. What a mess. Didn't work out. United States found it. Mexico was like, oh, I don't know. I don't know if they're going to get involved in this big mess. So, yeah, they didn't. War was declared. Here we go. April 4, 1917. President called for volunteers. This is the last straw on people. This is when Uncle Sam started to get used. United States joined the Allies against Germany. There were all these German liners which were seized. They backed the president, 373 to 50 in the House of Representatives. So lots of recruitment. Turning point in the war. The Allies' military effort against Germany would now be upheld by U.S. supplies and by enormous extensions of credit to England and France and Russia and the other members of the Allies. So let's go into a quick recap right now. This is a quick recap of what has been happening. So in the beginning, the alliance system was pushing Europe to a tipping point. Things were falling apart. These alliance systems were part of causing a war. The Central Powers, right? So we're looking at the Central Powers. They've come to be called this now. By the end of the war, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was falling apart around the edges. So Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. Italy actually stayed neutral until 1915, a year after the war started. And then they ended up joining in. The Ottoman Empire joined in as well, as in this with Bulgaria in 1915, around the time Italy joined in. So you've got all these different countries joining in as the Central Powers. Austria-Hungarian Empire was falling apart around the edges. Strongly insurgent nationalist movements by minorities. National minorities in it were fighting for independence or become part of other countries they felt more in common and culturally with, like Serbia. They felt more in common with Russia, for instance, because they were both Slavic. Austria-Hungary had 11 different ethnicities within it and languages. It was really complicated. There were flashpoints from the Slavic peoples in the Balkans, the Black Hand in Serbia, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Austria-Hungary attacked Serbia with Germany's backing. And then Russia mobilized along the German and Austro-Hungarian borders to defend Serbia. Germany declared war on Russia as well because there was an amassment there that ended up in war, and then invaded France through Belgium with the Schlieffen Plan. They expected Austria-Hungary to fight Russia while it concentrated on France so they could finish France off, and this did not happen quickly. So they ended up fighting on two fronts. The Belgians resisted, and then Britain got involved. Wow, what a mess. So here we go. You got this whole situation building up. So this is what happened with the Allied powers here. This is how it ended up being. So with this Balkan region fighting against the Central Powers here in Bulgaria, all this stuff. These areas technically neutral, except for the colonies, which were actually big chunks of these. Although it's very interesting to note how the different colonies fought and who fought within them, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. The Ottomans also, when they joined the Ottoman Empire, which was this vast empire that had been shrinking, they also used the cover of the conflict to settle scores with nationalist minority groups against their entire empire and neighboring regions. So they'd massacre Greek, Assyrian, and Armenian Christians in particular in these areas. These are genocides, highly organized and similar to World War II's Holocaust in many important respects. In particular, the Armenian genocide was horrific. 1.5 million people were killed in the Armenian genocide. Many of the people killing them were actually the people who were committing the genocide were Muslim refugees from the Balkan Wars over here. And they were themselves dispossessed and where they were at, and they were seeking revenge on Christians who had been dispossessing them and removing them from their lands and oftentimes genociding them out here. Then they'd come over here and get into more trouble fighting back. It's a ruthless cycle of violence that actually continued on and off well up through and flashing off well off up through the 1990s. Very, very messy. The excuse was that the Armenians here would ally with the Russians and attack the Ottoman Empire from within Turkey. So that was the excuse to exterminate the Armenians, was that they felt that they would end up allying with the Russians and attack them from within Turkey. Um, but that wasn't really what was happening. To this day, the Turkish government actually refuses to recognize the Armenian genocide, which brings enormous political pressure on any government that does. Um, the U.S. didn't actually recognize the Armenian genocide until 2019, when the U.S. Senate unanimously passed a resolution recognizing it, despite opposition from Donald Trump, who has a personal relationship with Turkey's current dictator, Recep Erdogan, and he felt the recognition would damage potential sales of U.S. weapons to Turkey. And Turkey's also a member of the NATO alliance, which is a modern alliance that came after World War II. In other words, with Turkey down here being a member of NATO and Russia not, for instance, today, if there was an attack on Turkey by any non-NATO force, the NATO members, all of them, which includes the US, France, the UK, etc., would have to rush to Turkey's defense. Does that sound familiar? Potentially a mess. Um, I want to just say right now that I normally cover the Armenian genocide with much more detail than this, and I really regret that in our current circumstances we have to do such a short description on this historic and often overlooked, extremely important atrocity. I'm including a link on Google Classroom for for this documentary called Screamers. It's a documentary about genocides in general with a focus on the Armenian genocide. It's partially produced by Serj Tankian, who is the singer for the Armenian progressive metal band System of a Down. You can get extra credit by watching this and answering a prompt that's attached to it, so you can see what it is. This is rated R for violence, the documentary, so you'll want to get your parents or guardians' permission. So, getting into the Allied powers, right? As we noted, the U.S. joined the war very late, and stalemate had been the main theme for a long time. So originally, it had just been basically, Russia, Britain, and France, joined by the United States, um, Japan, Serbia, Belgium, later Italy, who switched sides, and that's a really important thing to note about. Italy ended up switching sides. Um, Romania, Portugal, Brazil, the colonies of Britain, France, and Italy. So it looks like all these were like these countries fighting, but much of this had to do with colonization. Um, and so that's really important. Mexico, you'll note, remained neutral, although Japan actually ended up joining on the side of the Allies, and so did the national government in China under the influence of the colonial powers. These were all colonies, right? And these are the German colonies you can see here. It's important to note and interesting to note that people from the colonies fought in the major powers in the war, especially the British. Among the various colonies of the British Empire, India contributed the largest number of men, with approximately 1.5 million recruited in the war up to December of 1919. The Dominions, which were self-governing nations within the British Commonwealth, which included Canada, South Africa, Canada up here, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, and Newfoundland. They contributed a further 1.3 million men. Indians were the only non-white British colonists, so Indians from India were the only non-white British colonists who fought in the war. The rest of the people from the colonies were white or European descended. So you weren't going to see a lot of black South Africans fighting in Europe. It was going to be the white South Africans. By the way, Brazil joined in 1917 for similar reasons to the United States. Their army, their shipments of goods being blockaded and bombed by U-boats. Merchant ships were being sunk by German subs, and also ties with their former colonial controlling state, Portugal, here, which had joined the war as well. You'll note that Spain did not. And that's interesting that that comes into something coming up. Um, so this is a important thing to think about as we go into what happened with the Russian exit, which had a huge impact on the war as well, and actually a big impact on the war against the Allies. And so that was going to be a complicated thing. The war was going really badly for the Russians. The Tsar was at the front while the country was being run badly by his wife, who's under the influence of Rasputin, who we learned about. Unrest was growing, famine was spreading, revolution spread, as we learned all about in the Russian Revolution. The monarchy fell, and the Bolsheviks, which are the communists, took power. Lenin, the person who was in charge of the Bolsheviks, considered the war an imperialist conflict. And he made a deal to get out and declare Russian neutrality. The conditions on Russia were really harsh, and the penalties were severe. They lost a ton of territory. They lost the Baltic states up here, parts of like all these areas: Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. They lost all those areas. They lost a quarter of their population, a bunch of area here along Ukraine. Like, so this is area that were occupied under the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. All these areas ended up being occupied. So this area was all taken, and this is areas that was part of the Russian Empire. This was considered to be one of all the Russias, the third Russia. So that was a big deal, and it's also Russia's warm water port. Oh man, big mess going on here. So not so good. Ended up being a mess and continuing the civil war in Russia. 9/10 of their coal mines, 6 million German gold marks and reparations. So this set the stage for some other conflicts that came up. Um, Looked pretty bad for the Allies. Nearly 1 million French soldiers were killed. So 306,000 in 1914, 334,000 in 1915, 217,000 in 1916. Bad stuff. But anyway, in March 1917, again, this Russian exit, turmoil in Russia. Russians were weary of the war. Communist revolution. They offered Germany a truce, and the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk ended this war and lost a lot of territory. So big mess out here. Um, Things are looking kind of bad for the Allies. Germany's troops can now all go to the Western Front, so Germany doesn't have to fight on the Eastern Front anymore. Half of the French army mutinies. So we're saying nearly 1 million French soldiers had been killed. Since by early 1917, out of a population of 20 million French males, that's about a 20th of the French population. That's a really large percentage of the French population had been killed in fighting, and not to mention all the ones who had been injured, and many of whom could not function very well. So these losses had deadened the French will to attack, and it didn't help when half of the French army mutinied, so deserted. These were deserters, and this is tying into the deserter comic that you were looking at earlier. In 1917, in April, the French commander-in-chief, General Robert Nivelle, tried to break through the German lines on the Western Front and failed, with a heavy cost in French soldiers' lives. Troops refused to obey their officers' orders or go to the front. Mutinies were widespread and persistent and involved more than half the divisions of the French army. Um, Germans began the spring offensive and advanced to within 40 miles of Paris, closer to within 40 miles of Paris, close enough to shell the city. They tried to break. They used heavy Krupp railway guns that fired 183 shells in the capital, causing many people in Paris to flee. It was so successful that Kaiser Wilhelm II declared 24th of March a national holiday. Many Germans thought victory was near. However, after heavy fighting, the offensive was halted, and lacking tanks or motorized utility or artillery, the Germans were unable to consolidate their gains, so they weren't able to pull it together. The situation wasn't helped by the supply lines now being stretched as a result of their rapid advance over devastated ground. And to make things worse for the Germans, actually, after things had looked bad for the Allies because of the Russians, the Americans began to kick in and the flu epidemic began to get bad. So over 1 million fresh American troops arrived in the Western Front. There had only been a few tens of thousands of soldiers at first, and sea and naval support and on the sea, but that began to change with up to 1 million Americans arriving to fight on the Western Front. Um, so that was a big change to things. So soon after, the Second Battle of the Marne began. and the Hundred Days Offensive. So the Second Battle of the Marne lasted from July 15 to August 6, 1918, and was fought during World War I. It was conceived as an attempt to draw Allied troops south from Flanders to facilitate an attack in the region. It was an offense. The offensive along the Marne proved to be the last German army the German army would mount in the conflict. So that offensive did not work. It cost the Germans around 139,000 dead, just this one battle, and wounded, as well as 29,367 captured. Enormous casualties. Allied dead and wounded numbered 95,165 French, around 17,000 British, and 12,000 Americans. So heavy costs for the Allies as well, but ultimately more of a defeat for the Germans. It was the final German offensive of the war. It led many senior German commanders like Crown Prince Wilhelm to believe the war had been lost. And due to the severity of the defeat, the planned offensive in Flanders was canceled. And then there was a counterattack at Marne. So the first in a series of Allied offensives that began the 100-day offensive that would ultimately end the war. 2 days after the battle's end, the British troops attacked at Amiens. And that was 8 to 11 November, 8 August to 11 November. A series of massive Allied offensives followed this, which ultimately ended the First World War. There was also a revolution in Germany as people were disgusted with the government and tired of the war. So that led to the armistice of 11th of November 1918, which ended the war with an Allied victory. But we'll talk about that in a moment. There was also another factor going on that we're going to do a sidebar on here. The Spanish flu, so-called Spanish flu, had been rampaging through the ranks of soldiers and civilians on all sides, killing millions. Just a little side note here, the flu pandemic of 1918 is sometimes called the Spanish flu, even though it didn't start in Spain. It was called that because Spain just reported on it in its news. It was the only country it was one of the only countries not involved in the war in the region. So it didn't censor its news, and it made it the only country to report on the pandemic. So everybody thought it was associated with Spain. It probably began in Kansas. It is among the most horrific natural disasters in history. Between 20 and 40 million people are killed, around 3 to 6% of the world population. It killed mostly young adults as opposed to most flus, which kill infants and the elderly, and it killed very quickly. Some comparisons. You can see total deaths in World War I. There's 10 million military, around 7 to 10 million civilians, up to 20 million people. The Black Death, the Black Plague, killed around 25 million people in the 1300s. World War I, 60 million. Holocaust, around 6 million, these are huge numbers of people. SARS, 916 deaths. 9/11 around 3,000. Pearl Harbor, 2,400. Spanish flu is 20 to 40 million. So many people died from the Spanish flu. Population of Albany is around 18,000, right? Population of California is 40 million. Imagine all of California going. You imagine the devastation of the Spanish flu. We are in times, of course, we are dealing with another pandemic that is extremely troubling and difficult. It has a different action than this and has a different way that it goes. It's still very serious, and we have to look into lessons of the past to understand it. Nobody really knows the origin of the Spanish flu. There's been various speculations. Some think maybe Kansas, some think maybe Austria. It affected the Central Powers of World War I more directly as they got caught in one of the strongest viral waves that hastened the end of the war. So the flu used the body's own immune system to destroy the body, which is why young adults had a higher death rate than elderly and children. Basically, people with strong immune systems, it would cause them to go into overdrive, and so it would end up overwhelming the body. Something called cyanosis. One physician wrote that patients with seemingly ordinary influenza would develop the most vicious type of pneumonia that has ever been seen, and then it would just be a struggle for air until they suffocated. These are some of the camps that were set up. A lot of the things that we do now during this pandemic are very similar. Here was a jump rope rhyme from the time. I had a little bird. Its name was Enza. I opened the window and in flew Enza. Dark. Here's some areas in which the approximate beginning of the epidemic was. You can see really concentrated on the East Coast at first. It actually got very serious in the Bay Area. And you can see how it spread went about from looking at this map. So a very serious thing, and it caused a major change in the war. So going back to finish up here at the end of the war, the collapse of the Central Powers came swiftly. Bulgaria was the first to sign an armistice. on the 29th of September 1918 at Saloniki. On the 30th of October, the Ottoman Empire capitulated at Modros, signing the Armistice of Modros, which began the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire and consigned its remainders to the new state of Turkey. In October of 28th of 1918, the German Navy revolts, which was pretty much the end of Germany as a fighting force in this. So we were really running into a situation where the Germans were no longer going to be willing to fight for the country, for the Kaiser. The Kaiser fled to Holland actually on November 9th. He fled the country. So we're running into Germany's running up against the wall here. Germany surrendered on the Western Front. So November 1918, the Allies had ample supplies of men and material to invade, but no Allied force had yet crossed the German border, the German frontier at the time of the armistice. The Western Front was still some 450 miles from Berlin. The Kaiser's armies had retreated from the battlefield. So the Hindenburg and other senior German leaders began to spread the story around this time, even though there was surrender, that their armies had not really been defeated. This whole idea, even though they had already surrendered on the Western Front and signed an armistice on November 11th, 1918, Hindenburg and other German leaders began to start this stab in the back legend, which attributed Germany's defeat not to its inability to continue fighting, even though up to 1 million soldiers were suffering from flu and were unfit to fight, as well as revolutions within the troops and mutinies, but the public's failure to respond to its patriotic calling, and also the supposed international sabotage of the war effort, which they were blaming particularly on Jews, socialists, and Bolsheviks, which is going to tie very closely into the Nazi movement coming up before World War II. So Italy had also which had switched sides, also began a push that recovered territory. They recovered territory from Austria-Hungary. On the 3rd of November, Austria-Hungary also had had an armistice. The terms, which were arranged by telegraph, they were communicated and accepted. So they had to surrender. All this stuff ended very quickly, within a few weeks, essentially. And the Allies had much more potential wealth than they could spend on the war. One estimate using 1913 US dollars is that the Allies spent 58 billion on the war, and the Central Powers only 25 billion. The UK spent 21 billion, and the US 17 billion, but Germany spent 20 billion in and of itself, and the Allies just simply didn't have the kind of money, and they were running out of money. Austria-Hungary had lost a lot of its wealth. Of the 60 million European soldiers who were mobilized from 1914 to 1918, 8 million were killed, 7 million were permanently disabled, 15 million were seriously injured. Germany lost 15.1% of its active male population. Austria-Hungary lost 17%. France lost 10%. In Germany, civilian deaths were 474,000 higher than peacetime, due in large part to food shortages and malnutrition that weakened resistance to disease. By the end of the war, famine had killed approximately 100,000 people in Lebanon, in the Middle East. Just incredible amounts of people died in Russia. The Russian famine of 1921 from the civil wars as well. The estimates range from 5 million to 10 million people. By 1922, there were between 4.5 million and 7.5 million homeless children in Russia. And as a result of nearly a devastation from World War I, the Russian Civil War, and the subsequent famine of 20 to 22. So Russia was also in terrible straits. Everything was a mess. Europe looked very different, by the way. So we're going to learn more about the Treaty of Versailles, which was the conditions under which Germany had to surrender, and the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which we learned earlier from Russia. So this resulted in a new Europe. So these two things, how many new countries were created after the conclusion of World War I? And how do you think this might impact the future of Europe? This is your final prompt for today. There will be another assignment. It's not going to be a DBQ, as this says, but it's another assignment that you're going to be looking at. So how many new countries were created after the conclusion of World War I, and how do you think this might impact the future of Europe? Write a few sentences on this. Before and during World War I over to the left here, and after World War I to the right. So thanks for your attention today. You can now pause and complete this prompt, and then go on to your final assignment for the day, which you will complete before next class.